Even among regular JRPG fans, it's a tough sell to get gamers to consider Star Ocean relevant. The newest game in the franchise, The Divine Force, entered the arena on the 27th of October 2022. Releasing for PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series and PC, this game flew under the mainstream radar to the highest degree possible. The biggest issue with Star Ocean games is that they release quite sporadically, and never seem to do particularly well, even by genre standards. Some of the previous titles, Looking at You, Last Hope, hold infamous status with the trophy hunter community for their insane trophy demands, but that alone will not make a competent game in 2022. This installment, the 6th in the series, hopes to breathe new life into this franchise with a PC release alongside the consoles. This story gives players a choice of which character becomes the protagonist, but ultimately the bulk of the narrative for this party-based RPG remains the same. Raymond, the captain of a spacefaring merchant vessel, comes under attack and is forced to abandon his ship. He lands on the underdeveloped planet of Asta 4 and meets Princess Laeticia, who is searching for an old ally of her father's. This narrative follows Ray and Laeticia as they gather Ray's missing crew members and then assist Laeticia in trying to prevent her nation from going to war with the Imperial Army. Predictably, the Imperials themselves are being assisted by a technologically superior race who shouldn't be interfering with a primitive world. This story breaks a lot of the rules of the lore and universe it creates for the sake of progressing the plot, yet at all times we're very clear as to who is in the right and who is into the wrong from a moral standpoint. Ray helps because the story needs him to do so, while Laeticia has genuine roots in this world, which make her the better protagonist. Her reality is that of swords and magic, not space and androids, so she's the one on more of a journey of discovery as Ray's arrival opens her eyes to additional possibilities. Ultimately, both stories end up at the same place, a battle over the forces of evil to maintain peace in the galaxy. But what is valuable is how you get there. At times, this story falls into previous Star Ocean traps, such as having to backtrack on yourself frequently and a strange combat gimmick. However, this tale is the real deal, even if it gets bogged down in its exposition and terminology towards the end. The greatest compliment I can give this narrative is that it leans on its characters well at each turn, rather than expecting the story itself to do most of the heavy lifting. Midas is used particularly well in this regard. He's the early game's focal point, and the reason Nina's character joins the team. When he eventually joins himself, he doesn't just slink into the background. He's still a vital part of the narrative, and shepherds Malky's character into the team. He's also super broken in the endgame, which endeared him to the part of me that spent time in the postgame. This clever use of characters exists throughout the game, and while there are certainly some who are in the game just to be tossed aside as bad guys or plot devices, most of them are more valuable than that. The only characters in the game that I have issues with are Elena and Welch. The writing for Elena's character and the role that her android self takes in the plot are fine. She's actually the better of Ray's two prominent crewmen. My objection is completely and utterly to her character design, which makes her look like an inflatable sex toy. I mean, just look. Welch is going to be a real coin flip. She's nuts. She's well written for nuts, but everything about her is eccentric, from her outfit to her voice. I think her character works, and she's constantly quoting the names of other Star Ocean games in her speech. But she's a lot. Imagine the most high maintenance person you've ever met. Now imagine you're their personal assistant. Her sections are technically optional, but missing out on item creation in this type of game is enough pain on its own that you might just want to push through Welch's story arc anyway. The Divine Force's gameplay takes place from a third-person vantage point. You explore outside of towns and villages, battle monsters, and travel across the planet using the game's Duma. Most areas are large open outdoor environments with monsters to defeat. The other areas are towns and cities that you can buy supplies or rest at. This Star Ocean title has the largest regions to explore of any previous game, but the overall scope and scale of this product is similar to previous installments. On that note, the game does have a fast travel system that unlocks quite early on, and there are a handful of side quests that you will need to backtrack for, including the aforementioned Welch quests. The majority of the gameplay is either driven by following story markers or by exploiting the player's own desire to grind. Yes, this game does expect you to grind at least a little, and if you just barrel down the main story, you're going to get stomped at every boss encounter without fail. To this endeavour, you collect experience points, Fall, the game's main currency, and SP for upgrading and learning skills. These combine with the aforementioned grind to make the game at odds with itself in times. These large open areas are quite sparsely populated with enemies, making chaining fights together not a simple endeavour. Drops are also an issue early on. The natural item drop rate from enemies is poor, and until you unlock the ability to create items of your own that can have the plus item drop percentage on them, these two factors combine to make acquiring quest and upgrade items incidentally quite difficult. Progression is often the standout in Star Ocean games, with a multifaceted approach. You have the standard weapon, armor, and accessory slots. These provide natural stats like defense and resistances. Each item can also have bonus stats or traits, which can be acquired through random drops in the world or through using the item creation mechanic. As well as stats provided by gear, you can equip skills to use in combat, buff stats on a skill tree, and unlock new abilities and passive abilities. The currency for this SP can be spent to strengthen existing skills too. Each character can also perform different types of item creation, provided the relevant quest for Welch has been completed. This is the best way to get better than normal gear, and indeed, the only way to get certain endgame items. In truth, success in this game requires you to constantly work on all of these systems simultaneously. This isn't particularly difficult, but it can feel like you're micromanaging a lot on each character. This is particularly evident when regular enemies feel weak to the 4-character steamroller that you end up being in combat. This is mitigated by the AI having genuinely dumb moments, and there only being one character in the roster that has a decent heal or resurrect skill, making her a lock for nearly every party. All of these things may feel like they're optional, from the skills to item creation, but they really aren't. These mechanics are the bulk of the Star Ocean formula, and ignoring them is detrimental to your progression. I really like progression like this in my games, because it's so multifaceted. However, for your average non-JRPG casual gamer, I can see how this might come across as a lot, or at times frustrating. The combat here is real-time action, and sees the 4 chosen party members engage the enemy in primarily melee combat. Each ability or spell costs an amount of AP, which are the green icons you can see on screen here. These replenish over time as long as your character isn't performing another action, and the bar can be expanded by performing certain feats in combat. This is where I think the game tried to get a little too cute. You can have special abilities or combos that cost a recharge engage, but you need to have basic attacks to fill the gaps. Here, it's skills or nothing. If you drain the AP bar completely, you have to stand still and wait for it to recharge, which is a bit of an immersion killer. As such, combat here is much slower paced than it looks, as you're managing this gauge at all times. To help with this, you are given additional mobility powers in the form of Doomer. This primarily acts as a gap closer between you and your enemies, but also the reason for the game's new mechanic, Blindside. Using the speed of Doomer, you drop out of the line of sight of your enemy and create an opening for a back attack to deal extra damage. Some enemies without eyes are immune, but overall, these two systems make combat a bit more gimmicky than just functional. Later on, you do unlock powerful super attacks and the ability to sacrifice your mobility for a party-wide defensive aura, but both aren't necessary to your success. At least, not as necessary as getting those stat gains on your gear. The biggest issue I ended up having with this combat wasn't downtime or the lack of auto attack. Rather, the enemies seem to go out of their way to attack the player character, regardless of who that is or what it's doing to them at the time. Certain abilities can shift this to other characters and generate aggro of sorts, but the AI isn't great at using this to the effect of tanking. This is particularly noticeable if you play as a ranged character like Marielle, because you end up just kiting bosses and taking cheap pot shots when the opportunity arises. I suspect this is a large reason why both protagonists are melee fighters. Combat ends up being a little mixed as a result, and the traversal does end up being the same. You can quickly run from the start, which makes traversal tolerable until you get fast travel, and the platforming sections are made easy with the Doomer glide ability. You do feel a bit like Sonic having to collect all these Doomer points though. Never quite wore out its welcome, it's just something to make a note of. Technically, this held mostly at around 60 FPS, which seems to be the maximum frame rate the game can produce on PC. When you first boot the game, you have to run a shader compile, which runs like a CPU burn test. Even after running this, I did get frame drops in the game and had to ask some other users on Steam for help. This game doesn't necessarily run poorly, and as it is a niche product, I'm not going to bemoan the lack of ultra-wide support or that the frame rate is capped at 60. This is fine for where gaming is right now, as there are a lot of people still running at 1080p. My biggest issue with Star Ocean: The Divine Force is visual design. It's quite evident via the additional detail on Raymond's face, specifically his scars, that these feel like they were tacked on using the character creator of a free-to-play MMO. I already mentioned that Elena looks like a blow-up doll, but every other female character has similar problems. Each one of their models, aside from Malkia, needs aging at least a decade, and all facial animations and detail need reworking. I get that anime is going to anime, but these look terrifyingly lifeless at times. I wasn't expecting the lip syncing to be good, but this was in fact way beyond atrocious, even for the Japanese audio, and there's real inconsistency in the detail of world elements that made this feel and look like a PS3 game at times and a good PS4 game at others. I can't comment on the localization outside of saying the voice acting was fine. The story made sense, and aside from some chunky cutscenes where sci-fi expositions dropped on you quite heavily, this was a fairly well-paced delivery. I like the Star Ocean games because of their mechanics, their progression, and the fact that their stories are part JRPG fantasy, part episode of Stargate SG-1. The Divine Force is the first Star Ocean game where I have nice things to say about character writing and story, so it's clear that this franchise is heading in the right direction, albeit slower than its contemporaries. I may be alone in this opinion, but I like the changes they've made here to make the game more accessible, as ultimately, this franchise needs to appeal to a wider audience or it will fizzle out into nothingness. This is the best Star Ocean game to play if you haven't played a Star Ocean game before, but you have to go into this aware that I can't recommend it for everybody, and you will know, having seen this, if this is a game that you are going to like or not.